Hello and welcome to Talking While Cupping, the show where we break the golden rule of coffee tasting and tell you exactly what we think while we taste. I'm Markus Vestergaard and today we'll be talking about washed processed coffee. Here at Morgon Coffee Roasters, we love washed coffees. Why? They can be bright, clean, with a clear sense of origin, which we feel highlights the work of the producer as well as the terroir at the farm. Processing is what happens when you take a ripe coffee cherry and turn it into a dried seed ready for export. The washed process, sometimes called the wet process, is one of the most common ones and it's done all over the world. The washed process starts at the same point as the natural one and any other process as well, by picking ripe coffee cherries. You then sort out sticks and leaves and debris, and this in washed coffee, this is done by soaking the coffee and removing anything that would float. This also removes damaged or defect cherries, and I'll come back to that later. The next step is depulping the cherries, removing the seed from the coffee cherry. If you've ever de-pitted a cherry, you know what I'm talking about. Now, obviously, it would take a long time to de-pit the coffee the same way you do with a cherry at home. So producers usually use mechanical depulpers, and there are many different kinds of these, but the basic idea of them is that they use friction to remove the fruit from the seed. After removing the fruit, the coffee seeds are still covered in sticky mucilage, and we want to get rid of that. We've said it before, there are no hard guides or rules to processing. Every producer does it differently. But typically, the depulped seeds would be put into fermentation tanks with or without water and left there to ferment for everything between a couple of hours to several days. And this timing depends on several factors like the altitude, the climate, the style of processing, the experience of the producer. And once that's done, it gets rinsed and that removes the rest of the mucilage. Next, the coffee is set out to dry for anything from days to weeks, but typically a lot less than natural processed coffee. Now, let's talk about why we want to do this and how it all affects the cup profile. Firstly, the picking and sorting. I told you we'd come back to this. A word that gets thrown around a lot with washed coffees is clean. And cleanliness in the cup profile can refer to the lack of flavors like funk, alcohol, or boozy notes. With several stages of floating and sorting, washed processed coffee has a lot higher chance of catching those defect or damaged cherries that can't be picked up by the human eye. And if these are removed, we can end up with a much cleaner cup. Next up, the fermentation process. If you ferment the coffee too much, you end up with a boozy or alcoholic flavored coffee, and too little, you have too much mucilage left on the seeds, and putting those out to dry will give you more of a honey processed coffee. This can be drastically different from farm to farm. For example, a producer that we've been working with for years in Colombia, Sandra Milena Mora, she ferments her coffee up to 40 hours. This is because of the high altitude and colder climate, whereas a neighboring farm ferments his coffee only 18 hours. So this will vary from month to month, lot to lot, or batch to batch, and takes a lot of skill, experience, and attention to detail to process a clean, bright coffee with a clear sense of origin. If you've ever tried to make sourdough bread, you might have been frustrated by how the same recipe can yield different results. And then you'll know how finicky fermentation can be. And what does this fermentation process do exactly? Well, the main point of it is to remove the fruit and mucilage from the seed. And when we talked about natural processed coffee, we talked about how the prolonged contact of the seed with the mucilage and cherry gives a heavier body, deeper sweetness, and perhaps a not as clean cup. And the opposite can be said about washed coffee. You remove all that, you end up with a cleaner, brighter coffee with higher acidity and lighter body. You have something that's more slick, tea-like, and juicy. Like I said, it also tends to have a more pronounced acidity, mostly because there's less body and sweetness to balance this out. A washed processed Ethiopian coffee is a classic example of this. The body is light and tea-like, the acidity is pronounced and citric, and the flavors are a bit lighter rather than the deeper tropical fruit notes you might get from a natural processed Ethiopian coffee. The following message is brought to you by the Natural Processing Lobby. The washed process has its downsides too. It requires a lot of water. This can be difficult or expensive in communities where they don't have a high rainfall or access to fresh water. And then, once the coffee has been sitting in that water, it really needs to be filtered and cleaned before being fed out into the local ecosystem again. If it's not, it runs the risk of contaminating the groundwater. Some producers have filtration systems or processes to address this, but it can be very expensive and time-consuming, which might be hard for some producers to prioritize with the constant threat of coffee berry disease, climate change, and coffee prices being at a record low. Luckily, in recent years, we are seeing a lot of innovative producers come up with processes and systems to address this and produce washed coffees in a more sustainable way. Another reason we love washed coffees is the evenness of production. Like I mentioned before, the several steps of sorting and floating the beans, sorting out damaged and defect beans, will yield a more even, consistent end product. That makes it a lot easier for us to roast, easier for you to brew, and in my opinion, easier to enjoy. They also produce less Quakers, which is a defect that comes from unripe coffee cherries in the batch. These contains a lot more moisture, and when we roast them, we drive out the moisture, but as a few beans will have a higher moisture, they won't roast the same as the other beans, ending up a light shade of brown and just tasting like popcorn. However, the main reason that we at Morgon Coffee Roasters love washed coffee comes down to tasting the terroir. While a natural coffee can definitely be delicious as well, with bolder, sweeter, and fun, funky notes as well, that profile can be a bit generic to the process, whereas the washed process removes all of that and brings out the true inherent profile of that varietal grown at that specific farm and the work of that producer. And to me, that's what this is all about and what's so exciting about coffee. I hope you've gotten some insights into washed processed coffee, what it tastes like, why it's done, how it's done, and why I love it so much. If you have any questions, put them down below. And as always, smash that like and subscribe button. Thanks for watching, and see you next time on Talking While Cupping.